Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The village hall at Barton-le had always been a place of mild discomfort for Miss Jane Marple. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it encouraged a certain kind of behaviour she distrusted, the eagerness to speak, the reluctance to listen, and the dangerous belief that shared spaces produced shared truths. On this particular afternoon the hall was filled to capacity, and the air carried the mingled scents of polish, damp coats and restrained excitement. The occasion was an ordinary one, a charity tea organised with admirable efficiency by the Women's Improvement Committee, complete with neatly folded programmes and plates of identical sponge cake. It was precisely the sort of event that reassured a village about itself. Nothing improper ever happened at such gatherings. That, Miss Marple reflected as she took her seat near the back, was why they were so useful. Voices overlapped pleasantly, teacups clinked, laughter rose and fell in polite waves. On the small raised platform at the front of the hall sat Mrs. Eleanor Price, chairwoman of the committee, her posture immaculate, her smile practised. She was flanked by Mr. Harold Kemp, the village treasurer, who looked faintly uncomfortable in a suit that had been brushed too vigorously, and Miss Lillian Crowe, the schoolmistress, who observed the room with an expression of alert detachment. Miss Marple watched them all with mild interest. Mrs. Price stood to welcome everyone, tapping her teaspoon gently against a cup to gain attention. The sound cut through the chatter with surprising authority. "Now then," she said brightly, "if everyone could settle for just a moment. Before we enjoy our tea, there's a small matter I'd like to address." Miss Marple felt it then, the faint tightening in the room. Conversations ceased a fraction too quickly. Teacups paused midway to lips. "A small matter," Mrs. Price continued, her smile unwavering, "concerning the safeguarding of our community." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Mrs. Price gestured toward a stack of folders on the table beside her. Over the years the committee has maintained records, perfectly ordinary records, of course, financial notes, correspondence, minutes of meetings. However, it has come to my attention that certain documents have gone missing. A ripple moved through the hall. Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Kemp shifted in his chair, his hand moving instinctively toward his tie. Miss Crowe's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained neutral. "These documents," Mrs. Price went on, "contain sensitive information. Not secrets exactly, but matters that could be misunderstood if taken out of context." Miss Marple thought that was an interesting distinction. Mrs. Price's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on familiar faces. "Naturally, we wish to resolve this discreetly. Barton-le has always prided itself on propriety." At that moment, a chair scraped loudly near the side wall. Heads turned. Mr. Samuel Dyer, a retired clerk known for his precise habits and rigid views, had risen halfway from his seat, his face flushed. "This is outrageous," he said. "If you're suggesting impropriety—" Mrs. Price raised her hand gently. "No accusations are being made, Mr. Dyer, please." He sank back down, muttering. Miss Marple observed how quickly irritation gave way to embarrassment. People disliked being reminded that they were being watched, even collectively. Mrs. Price drew a breath. "We will, of course, look into the matter. In the meantime, I ask everyone to remember the importance of discretion." With that, she smiled again and declared the tea open. Conversation resumed, but it had changed. Voices were lower now, glances sharper. Miss Marple accepted a cup from a passing volunteer and did not drink. She rarely did until she had finished observing. She noticed how Miss Crowe leaned toward Mr. Kemp, whispering something that made him nod rapidly. She noticed Mrs. Price's hand resting protectively on the folders, as though they might flee. She noticed how several women glanced instinctively toward Mrs. Agnes Holt, who sat stiffly near the aisle, her mouth compressed into a thin line. Mrs. Holt was known for her devotion to moral order and her enthusiasm for documentation. Miss Marple sipped nothing and listened to everything. The first scream came not from the platform but from the corridor behind the hall. It was sharp, brief, and unmistakably genuine. For a moment no one moved. Then chairs scraped, voices rose, and someone knocked over a tray. Mrs. Price stood abruptly, her composure cracking at last. Miss Marple rose more slowly, following the crowd toward the open door at the rear. The corridor was narrow and dimmer than the hall. At its far end stood the filing room, a small space rarely used except by committee members. The door was ajar. Inside, slumped against the metal filing cabinet, was Mrs. Agnes Holt. Her eyes were open, unseeing. One hand clutched a sheaf of papers, crumpled and torn. Dark stains spread across her blouse, and the sharp smell of iron hung in the air. Someone began to sob. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze moving from the papers to the cabinet drawers, one of which hung open. Files spilled onto the floor, their labels visible even at a distance. Confidential, personal, disciplinary. Miss Marple felt a familiar, unwelcome certainty settle over her. This was no sudden act of violence born of temper. This was an interruption, a desperate one. Mrs. Holt had not screamed because she was surprised. She had screamed because she had understood. Behind her, the voices of Barton Lee blurred into a single anxious murmur. Already, Miss Marple could hear the beginnings of explanation, of reassurance, of stories forming themselves into something manageable. She looked again at the scattered papers and thought of Mrs. Price's careful words. Not secrets exactly. Miss Marple folded her hands and waited. The village scandal file had been opened, and someone, she knew with quiet certainty, would kill to close it again. The corridor filled as quickly as the hall had emptied, bodies pressing forward with the same urgent curiosity that often disguised itself as concern. Someone called for air. Someone else insisted on water. A third voice repeated too loudly that this could not possibly be happening here, not in Barton Lee, not at a charity tea. Miss Marple stood just inside the doorway of the filing room and let the commotion settle around her like the weather. Mrs. Agnes Holt lay at an awkward angle against the cabinet, her legs folded beneath her as though she had tried to sit down and had simply forgotten how. The papers in her hand had been crushed so tightly the edges were torn. Miss Marple noticed that the fingers clutching them were stained dark, not only with blood but with something else, ink perhaps, or the residue of old carbon paper. Mrs. Eleanor Price pushed forward, pale but determined to be seen in control. She took one look at Mrs. Holt and made a thin sound in her throat that might have been grief or shock or simple annoyance at disorder. "Someone fetch the doctor," she said sharply, as if direction could reverse time. Mr. Harold Kemp hovered just behind her, his eyes fixed on the open cabinet drawer. Miss Lillian Crowe stood slightly apart, her face composed, her gaze moving not to the body but to the scattered files on the floor. P.C. Morrow arrived within minutes, breathless and out of his depth. He took one look at the scene and blanched. "Right," he said, attempting firmness. "Everyone back, please. Give her space." No one moved until he repeated it louder. Even then they only shifted a little, reluctant to lose their view. Dr. Anstruther, who had been seated near the front of the hall before the scream, pushed through with professional impatience. He knelt beside Mrs. Holt, checked for signs of life, and then stood slowly. "I'm afraid she's gone," he said, voice low. A collective murmur rose, part horror, part confirmation. Barton Lee had a body now, and with it, a story that would be retold for years. Mrs. Price pressed her hand to her mouth. But how? Dr. Anstruther's eyes went to the dark stains. A sharp injury, likely a blade. We'll know more later. P.C. Morrow swallowed visibly. "I'll send for Inspector," "Inspector Hargreaves from Market Ashford. No one is to leave the hall grounds until he arrives." This was met with protest at once. "I have children at home," someone said. "My husband will worry," another insisted. "This is ridiculous," Mr. Samuel Dyer snapped. "We are respectable people." Miss Marple thought that the word respectable was often used at precisely the moments it ceased to be relevant. Mrs. Price stepped forward, her voice brisk again. "Everyone will cooperate. Of course we will. Barton Lee has nothing to hide." Miss Marple's gaze moved, almost without her willing it, to the open filing drawer. If there was one thing a village could hide very well, it was precisely what it believed it had a right to hide. They were herded back into the hall, where teacups still sat half-finished and plates of cake remained untouched. The cheerful bunting seemed absurd now, like decoration hung in the wrong season. People clustered in tight groups, speaking in urgent whispers. Every conversation had the same shape: shock, speculation, reassurance, accusation. "It must have been a stranger," Mrs. Leonard insisted. "Someone wandering in. There are no strangers in Barton Lee," replied another voice. "Then it's someone who pretended not to be," Mrs. Leonard said, as though pleased with the cleverness of it. Miss Marple sat where she had been earlier, near the back, and listened. She saw Mrs. Price conferring with Mr. Kemp in hurried murmurs. She saw Miss Crowe watching them, her expression unreadable. She saw Mr. Dyer glaring at everyone with equal suspicion, as if outrage were a form of innocence. P.C. Morrow took statements clumsily, asking who had gone near the corridor, who had seen Mrs. Holt, who knew why she had been in the filing room at all. Answers came too quickly, as though speed could substitute for truth. "She went out to fetch more cups," someone said. "No, she went because she's always poking into things," said another, half resentful. "She was upset after Mrs. Price spoke," someone else whispered. "I saw her face." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at that. People often noticed faces when they were looking for drama, but they rarely understood what they saw. At last, Inspector Hargreaves arrived. Tall, grey-templed, with the calm manner of a man who had seen village panic before and knew it always followed the same rules. He spoke briefly with the constable, then entered the hall and surveyed the crowd. "Good afternoon," he said, as if greeting them at a parish meeting rather than a crime scene. "I'm Inspector Hargreaves. I will ask you to remain seated. We will do this properly, and we will do it calmly." His eyes moved across the room and paused, momentarily, on Mrs. Price. "You announced missing documents," he said. "Then Mrs. Holt is found dead in the filing room. I would like to understand the connection." Mrs. Price drew herself up. "There may be no connection at all. This is a dreadful coincidence." Inspector Hargreaves nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a possibility rather than accepting it. "Then we will begin with facts." He asked to see the filing room. Miss Marple rose as he did, not pushing forward, merely following at a measured distance. She knew, as she always did, that the important things were rarely in the centre of the crowd. In the corridor, the air felt colder now. The filing room was still, the cabinet drawers still open. Inspector Hargreaves stood over the scattered files, scanning labels without touching them. "A scandal file," he murmured almost to himself. "That's what this looks like." Mrs. Price flushed. "Those are committee records." "Labelled confidential, personal, disciplinary," the inspector said, mild but pointed. "Unusual for cake raffles and hymn sheet printing." Mrs. Price's jaw tightened. "We kept notes on matters that might affect the village, to prevent harm." Prevent, Miss Marple thought, was another word that often meant control. Inspector Hargreaves crouched beside Mrs. Holt. He examined the papers still clenched in her hand, then looked toward the floor near her shoes. Miss Marple's eyes went there too. A small brass key lay half under the cabinet, its edge smeared with a dark stain. Not blood, something thicker, older, ink perhaps, or polish. It looked as if it had been handled often. Inspector Hargreaves pointed without picking it up. "Whose key is that?" Mrs. Price spoke quickly. "The filing cabinet is locked. Only the committee officers have keys." "And Mrs. Holt?" he asked. "She insisted on having access," Mrs. Price replied, too sharp. "For organization." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Price's face as she said it. The words were annoyed, but beneath them was something else, fear of what that access truly meant. Inspector Hargreaves stood. "I will need a list of everyone who holds a key, and I will need to know what Mrs. Holt was holding." He nodded toward the crumpled pages. Miss Marple stepped closer, just enough to see a few words through the creases. Names, dates, and a heading stamped in red. "Complaint received." Beneath it, a second stamp, "Action pending." Her eyes drifted to the torn edge where something had been ripped away, an attachment perhaps, or a second page removed in haste. In the hall behind them, the village murmured, building its theories as quickly as it had poured its tea. Miss Marple looked once more at the key, then at the open drawer, then at Mrs. Holt's clenched hand. Mrs. Holt had not died merely because she found the files. She had died because she found the right one. By the following morning, Barton Lee had transformed itself into a village under inspection. Doors opened more cautiously. Conversations lowered at once when footsteps approached, and every ordinary action seemed charged with the awareness that someone, somewhere, was listening. The charity tea already felt distant, unreal, as though it belonged to a different village entirely. Inspector Hargreaves established his temporary base in the village hall. The bunting had been taken down, the tables cleared, and the space stripped back to its bare functionality. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, not for celebration now, but for questioning. Miss Marple arrived early, settling herself near the side, unnoticed amid the low hum of anticipation. The first to be called was Mrs. Eleanor Price. She entered with composed dignity, her hat perfectly straight, her gloves immaculate. She answered questions crisply, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Yes, she had announced the missing documents. Yes, she had known Mrs. Holt well. No, she had not expected such a terrible outcome. "We maintained records only for the good of the village," she said. "Barton Lee has always valued discretion." "And who decided what required discretion?" Inspector Hargreaves asked mildly. Mrs. Price paused just long enough to be noticeable. "The committee," she said, "collectively." "And Mrs. Holt?" he asked. "What was her role?" "She was thorough," Mrs. Price replied carefully. "Overzealous at times. She took it upon herself to investigate complaints." "Complaints about whom?" the inspector pressed. "About behavior," Mrs. Price said. "Conduct unbecoming. Matters should be resolved quietly." Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Price avoided specifics, as though detail itself were dangerous. Mr. Harold Kemp followed. He appeared less controlled, his fingers fidgeting with his hat as he spoke. He admitted that he held a key to the filing cabinet, as did Mrs. Price and Mrs. Holt. He insisted he had never used the files for personal reasons. They were there to protect people, he said defensively, to stop rumors. "And did they?" Inspector Hargreaves asked. Mr. Kemp hesitated. "They stopped trouble." Miss Marple thought that trouble, like truth, rarely appreciated being stopped. Miss Lillian Crow's interview was different. She answered calmly, with careful precision, her words measured. "I opposed the files," she said quietly. "I felt they crossed a line." "And yet you remained on the committee," the inspector observed. "Yes," Miss Crow replied. "I believed I could moderate their use." Inspector Hargreaves regarded her thoughtfully. "Did Mrs. Holt share your view?" Miss Crow's eyes flicked briefly toward the corridor. "No, she believed rules required enforcement." Miss Marple noted the distinction. Enforcement implied power, moderation implied restraint. As the day progressed, the picture grew clearer. Complaints had been logged for years, Anonymous letters, whispered accusations, minor indiscretions elevated into permanent records. Nothing overtly criminal, but enough to ruin reputations if exposed, enough to exert pressure. Mrs. Holt had been its most devoted custodian. Inspector Hargreaves invited Miss Marple to walk with him through the village that afternoon. The lane was quiet, sunlight filtering through trees heavy with leaves. "You noticed something last night," he said. "I could see it." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Holt was not surprised to find the files. She was determined. "Meaning?" "She went into that room knowing she might find something dangerous," Miss Marple said. "But she believed herself protected by righteousness." The inspector nodded, and someone believed otherwise. They stopped near the churchyard, where Mrs. Holt's name had already begun to circulate in hushed tones. Mrs. Holt was not universally liked, Inspector Hargreaves continued. She had a habit of reminding people of past mistakes. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "people rarely forgive those who remember too well." That evening, new information emerged. One of the files was missing entirely. The cabinet showed signs of hurried searching, papers disturbed in a way inconsistent with casual handling. Inspector Hargreaves returned to the hall and called Mrs. Price and Mr. Kemp together. "Someone removed a file," he said. After Mrs. Holt accessed the cabinet, Mrs. Price stiffened. "Impossible." "On the contrary," he replied, "quite deliberate." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Price's hands tighten in her lap. "Which file?" she asked. "The one Mrs. Holt was holding," the inspector said. "The torn edge suggests an attachment removed, something she found alarming enough to confront someone." "And you believe that confrontation led to murder?" Mr. Kemp asked, his voice thin. "I believe," the inspector replied, "that Mrs. Holt intended to use what she found." "How do you use it?" Mrs. Price demanded. Inspector Hargreaves met her gaze steadily. "That remains to be seen." Later, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, knitting slowly. She thought of Mrs. Holt, rigid in her devotion to rules, convinced that exposure equaled justice. She thought of Mrs. Price, equally convinced that concealment equaled protection. Both, Miss Marple reflected, were dangerous certainties. The village had tolerated the scandal file because it spared them public conflict, because it promised order, because it placed judgment in the hands of those who claimed to know best. Mrs. Holt had believed she was guardian of morality. Someone else had believed she was a liability. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. The truth, she knew, lay not only in who held the knife, but in who feared the paper Mrs. Holt had torn away. And until that fear was understood, Barton Lee would continue to whisper around its own reflection, pretending that silence was the same thing as peace. As the second day of questioning unfolded, Barton Lee began to reveal the less polished version of itself that lay beneath its careful manners. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a restless anxiety that manifested in small irritations and hurried judgments. People were no longer content merely to be questioned. They wanted conclusions, preferably simple ones. Inspector Hargreaves felt the pressure keenly. He moved through the village with measured calm, but Miss Marple could see how often he paused, letting people talk themselves into revealing more than they intended. It was not facts they offered most readily, but grievances. Mrs. Holt, it emerged, had been feared as much as she had been respected. She never forgot anything, Mrs. Leonard said stiffly, her hands clenched in her apron. You made one mistake years ago, and she'd remember it as though it were yesterday. And remind you? Inspector Hargreaves asked. Oh, yes, Mrs. Leonard replied, quietly, very quietly. Miss Marple noted how resentment crept into the woman's voice, despite her obvious discomfort at speaking ill of the dead. Mr. Samuel Dyer was less restrained. He spoke with righteous indignation, as though offence were proof of innocence. She took it upon herself to judge people, he said, always asking questions, always writing things down. And did you ever appear in the files? the inspector asked mildly. Mr. Dyer flushed. That's hardly the point. Miss Marple thought it very much was. By midday, Inspector Hargreaves had established one thing beyond doubt. Mrs. Holt had intended to confront someone that afternoon. Several witnesses recalled seeing her rise abruptly after Mrs. Price's announcement, her face set with purpose rather than fear. She had not gone to the filing room by accident, nor out of curiosity. She looked angry, one woman said, determined. Anger, Miss Marple reflected, often masked certainty, and certainty was rarely without consequence. The missing file became the center of the investigation. Inspector Hargreaves gathered the remaining documents and began to examine them more closely. Miss Marple was present when he spread them across a long table in the hall, the labels stark against the bare wood. Complaint received, observation log, action deferred, dates stretched back years, names appeared more than once. Someone had been very busy, the inspector remarked. And very patient, Miss Marple added. This was not idle gossip, it was curated. Miss Crowe, summoned again, confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. Mrs. Holt believed these files were protection, she said quietly. She believed that people behaved better when they knew they were being watched. And did they? Inspector Hargreaves asked. Miss Crowe hesitated. They behaved more carefully. That is not quite the same thing, Miss Marple murmured. That afternoon brought a subtle but significant shift. Inspector Hargreaves asked each committee member the same question. Who would you be most concerned about if these files became public? The answers were revealing, not for their content, but for their speed. Some answered too quickly, others took far too long. Mrs. Price's response was polite. Everyone. Reputations would be damaged indiscriminately. Mr. Kemp swallowed before answering. People would misunderstand. Miss Crowe said nothing at first. Then those with the most to lose. Inspector Hargreaves looked at her sharply. And who were they? She met his gaze steadily. Not always the ones who appeared most respectable. Miss Marple felt a familiar, quiet satisfaction. Truth, she knew, often arrived disguised as understatement. Late in the day, Inspector Hargreaves called Mrs. Price back once more. This time, he asked her to recount the exact moment she noticed the files were missing. I discovered it during a routine check, she said firmly, before the tea, and you chose to announce it publicly, he said. Yes, transparency. Or control, Miss Marple thought. Inspector Hargreaves leaned forward. Mrs. Price, did Mrs. Holt ever threaten to expose what was in those files? Mrs. Price stiffened. Threaten is a strong word. Did she say she intended to act? He pressed. A silence followed, heavier than the others. She was concerned, Mrs. Price said finally. She felt the committee had grown complacent, and that displeased her, the inspector said. Mrs. Price's lips tightened. She took things too far. Miss Marple watched the exchange carefully. There it was again, the quiet assumption that limits were acceptable, provided one controlled where they were drawn. That evening, Inspector Hargreaves shared his thoughts with Miss Marple as they walked slowly past the churchyard. Mrs. Holt believed exposure was justice, he said. Someone else believed silence was protection. Between the two, someone chose violence. Yes, Miss Marple replied, but only because the file existed at all. He glanced at her. You think the murder was inevitable? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that when people are given power without accountability, they will eventually use it to protect themselves. The day ended without an arrest, but not without progress. The village, sensing the investigation tightening, grew quieter. Conversations stopped abruptly when others approached. Doors closed more firmly at dusk. Miss Marple returned home and sat with her knitting, reflecting on how neatly Barton Lee had constructed its own danger. A system designed to avoid scandal had created one far worse. Mrs. Holt had believed she was enforcing morality. Someone else had believed she was about to destroy it. Between belief and fear, Miss Marple knew, there was often only a single step, and someone in Barton Lee had already taken it. The third day brought rain, steady and insistent, as though Barton Lee itself wished to wash something away. The village moved more quietly under grey skies, umbrellas held low, faces turned inward. What had begun as shock had hardened into suspicion, and suspicion now settled unevenly, clinging to familiar names with uncomfortable persistence. Inspector Hargreaves continued methodically, unaffected by the village's growing impatience. He understood that when people wanted resolution most urgently, it was precisely the moment to slow down. Miss Marple accompanied him that morning as he revisited the filing room. The space had been sealed overnight, and the air inside felt stale, heavy with old paper and something sharper, fear, perhaps, lingering in the imagination. The cabinet drawers had been numbered now, each file photographed, catalogued, and returned to place. "All very proper," the inspector murmured, "which makes it all the more troubling." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Impropriety rarely announces itself as a disorder." Inspector Hargreaves pointed to a thin gap where the missing file should have been. This one was removed cleanly, not snatched in panic. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. "And where to find it," Miss Marple added, which suggests familiarity. They moved on to the remaining documents. Miss Marple did not read every page, but she absorbed patterns. Certain names appeared repeatedly, often accompanied by vague annotations, inappropriate familiarity, questionable conduct, unresolved concern. Nothing precise, nothing provable. Everything is suggestive. "It's a system built on implication," Miss Marple said softly. "Very effective." Inspector Hargreaves nodded. Enough to frighten people, enough to control them. Later that morning, new tensions surfaced. Mr. Kemp was seen arguing heatedly with Mrs. Price outside the hall. Their voices carried despite attempts at discretion. "You should never have told them," he hissed. "They had a right to know," Mrs. Price snapped back. "This wouldn't have happened if Agnes hadn't—" She stopped abruptly, noticing Miss Marple nearby. Her expression rearranged itself into something composed, but the damage was done. The argument lingered like a stain. Inspector Hargreaves took note. By midday, the inspector began asking a different kind of question, one that unsettled people far more than accusations. What would Mrs. Holt have done next? Answers varied wildly. "She'd have gone to the vicar," someone said. "She'd have written letters," another insisted. "She'd have called a meeting," Mrs. Leonard whispered, clearly horrified by the idea. Miss Marple listened and considered. Mrs. Holt had believed in process, in order, in recorded truth. She would not have acted impulsively. She would have prepared, which meant someone had known what she was preparing to do. That afternoon, Inspector Hargreaves summoned Miss Crowe again. Their conversation lasted longer than the others. "She came to me once," Miss Crowe admitted quietly. "Agnes, I mean. She was troubled." "By what?" the inspector asked. "By a file she believed had been ignored for too long," Miss Crowe said. "She said the committee was protecting the wrong people." "And did she say which people?" Inspector Hargreaves pressed. Miss Crowe hesitated. "No." "But she was very firm. She said the village needed to be shocked into honesty." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Shock, she knew, was a dangerous ambition. "And when was this?" the inspector asked. "The day before the tea," Miss Crowe replied. Inspector Hargreaves leaned back slowly. "Did she say what she intended to do at the meeting?" "She said she would force the issue," Miss Crowe said, "publicly if necessary." The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows. That evening the inspector shared his thoughts with Miss Marple over a late cup of tea in her sitting room. "Mrs. Holt was not killed to protect the files," he said. "She was killed to stop an announcement." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Which means someone believed they would be named." And that someone had access, he continued, to the files, the keys, and Mrs. Holt herself. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Fear sharpens memory. Whoever acted knew exactly what Mrs. Holt was capable of. The next development came unexpectedly. A folded envelope was discovered in the vicarage postbox, unaddressed but unmistakably recent. Inside was a single sheet of paper, torn cleanly from a larger document. Inspector Hargreaves examined it carefully. The heading read, "Formal Recommendation." Beneath it were 3 typed names. One of them belonged to Mr. Harold Kemp. The inspector said nothing at first. He folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. "That would explain the panic," he said at last. "Financial irregularities, perhaps. Misuse of funds, enough to ruin a reputation," Miss Marple said, "and enough to justify drastic action in a frightened mind." "But," the inspector added slowly, "there are 2 other names." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear is rarely solitary. That night, Barton Lee slept uneasily. Lights burned later than usual. Curtains twitched. People imagined footsteps where there were none. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting steadily, her mind calm despite the tension. She reflected on how the scandal file had become a weapon not because of what it proved, but because of what it implied. Guilt thrived in ambiguity. Innocence had no defense against suggestion. Mrs. Holt had believed she was wielding the truth. Someone else had believed she was wielding destruction. Miss Marple paused her knitting briefly, considering the torn paper, the raised voices, the rain that refused to stop. The village was very close now to the truth, and as always the most dangerous moment was not the crime itself, but the instant just before it was finally understood. By the 4th day, the rain had cleared, leaving Barton Lee under a pale, washed light that made every detail seem sharper. The village appeared calm on the surface, but beneath it lay a taut expectancy, like a held breath. Everyone sensed that the investigation had narrowed, that the truth was no longer dispersed among possibilities, but converging towards something specific and unavoidable. Inspector Hargreaves felt it too. He moved with renewed precision, calling people back for second conversations, revisiting statements, listening not so much to what was said as to what changed. Miss Marple accompanied him when invited and observed quietly when she was not, her presence so unremarkable that people forgot to guard themselves. Mr. Harold Kemp was among the first summoned again. He arrived at the hall pale and defensive, his earlier confidence gone. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. "I've already told you everything," he said. "Yes," Inspector Hargreaves replied calmly, "but circumstances have changed." He placed the folded envelope on the table between them and slid out the torn sheet. Kemp's eyes went to it at once, then away. "This was found yesterday," the inspector said. "Do you recognize it?" Kemp swallowed. "It looks official. It names you," the inspector continued, "along with 2 others. Mrs. Holt intended to act on it." Kemp's composure cracked. "She misunderstood," he said quickly. "There was nothing improper, just accounting errors. Errors large enough to warrant a formal recommendation?" the inspector asked. Kemp leaned forward, desperation edging his voice. "It would have destroyed me, you must understand. People would have assumed the worst." Miss Marple watched him closely. Fear radiated from him, but it was not the fear of a murderer, it was the fear of exposure. "And the other 2 names?" Inspector Hargreaves asked. Kemp shook his head. "I don't know who they are. Agnes never told me." "But you knew you were in the file," the inspector said. Kemp hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. She hinted. She enjoyed that. After he left, Inspector Hargreaves sat in silence for a moment. "He's frightened," he said, "but I don't believe he killed her." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "He lacks the necessary decisiveness." The next conversation was with Mrs. Eleanor Price. She arrived immaculate as always, but there was a tightness around her eyes now that no amount of composure could disguise. "You found something," she said before the inspector spoke. "Yes," he replied, "and I'd like to ask about your relationship with Mrs. Holt." Mrs. Price stiffened. She was useful. A curious choice of word, the inspector observed. She was efficient, Mrs. Price corrected herself. She believed in order. "And did you?" he asked. Mrs. Price's lips thinned. "Order is essential." Inspector Hargreaves placed the torn paper on the table. "Were you named?" Mrs. Price's gaze flicked to it, then away. "I don't see how that's relevant." Mrs. Holt believed the village needed to be shocked into honesty, he said. "You announced the missing files publicly, then she was found dead. That sequence matters." Mrs. Price's composure finally wavered. She was reckless, she said sharply. She didn't understand what she was risking. "And you did?" the inspector asked quietly. Silence stretched. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Price's hand moved unconsciously toward the place where a brooch usually rested, though she was not wearing one today. A habitual gesture seeking reassurance that was no longer there. She was going to ruin people, Mrs. Price said at last. "Good people, or powerful ones," Miss Marple murmured gently. Mrs. Price's eyes snapped to her. "You don't understand what would have happened." "I understand," Miss Marple said calmly, "that you believed yourself the guardian of the village." Mrs. Price straightened. Someone had to be. Inspector Hargreaves let the words settle. "Did you know what Mrs. Holt intended to announce that afternoon?" "Yes," Mrs. Price said, too quickly. Then, after a pause, in general terms. "And did you confront her?" he asked. Mrs. Price's voice lowered. "I tried to reason with her." "Where?" the inspector pressed. "In the corridor," she said, "near the filing room." Miss Marple felt the shape of the truth begin to form. "And when reasoning fails?" Inspector Hargreaves asked. Mrs. Price closed her eyes briefly. She wouldn't listen. She said the village deserved to know. That evening, Inspector Hargreaves walked with Miss Marple along the edge of the green. The village looked deceptively peaceful, children playing, dogs barking in the distance. She believed exposure would destroy everything she'd built, he said. Not just her reputation, her authority. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and authority once threatened can be dangerous." She didn't plan to kill, the inspector said, but she panicked. "Panic," Miss Marple said gently, "is often the result of certainty collapsing." The final piece came later that night, when forensic confirmation established that the blade used had come from the village hall kitchen, cleaned hastily but imperfectly. Mrs. Price had been seen near the kitchen moments before the scream. By morning the conclusion was unavoidable. Mrs. Eleanor Price was arrested quietly, without drama. Barton Lee watched from behind curtains and half-open doors, absorbing the reality with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant recognition. The woman who had organized their events, guided their committees and guarded their reputations was taken away as a murderer. Miss Marple stood at her window and observed the village settling into stunned silence. Mrs. Holt had believed in exposure. Mrs. Price had believed in concealment. Between them lay the fatal moment when one certainty collided with another. The scandal file would be dismantled, its contents reviewed, its power neutralized, but the damage it had done lingered, etched into the village's awareness. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts steady. The truth, she reflected, had never been hidden very deeply. It had merely been protected by the belief that some people knew best. The arrest of Mrs. Eleanor Price altered Barton Lee in a way no announcement ever could. The village did not erupt into outrage or grief. Instead, it folded inward, as though bracing itself against a chill it had not anticipated. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evenings, Voices dropped instinctively, and familiar greetings carried an undertone of uncertainty. People were no longer sure what, or whom, to trust. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet attentiveness. By the next morning, the village hall stood empty and locked, its notice board stripped bare. The Women's Improvement Committee was dissolved without ceremony. No one volunteered to take charge of anything just yet. It was as though Barton Lee had collectively decided to pause. Inspector Hargreaves remained for several days to complete formalities. He oversaw the securing of the files, now boxed and sealed, their labels covered, their authority finally removed. A review would follow, he explained, to determine what should be destroyed and what, if anything, required official action. Most of it, he said to Miss Marple as they stood in the hall one afternoon, amounts to suggestion and inference. Yes, Miss Marple replied, that was precisely its power. Mrs. Holt's funeral was held quietly, attended by nearly the entire village. There were no speeches beyond the vicar's measured words about dedication and duty. People spoke afterward in subdued tones, careful not to praise too much, careful not to criticize at all. Mrs. Holt was remembered as diligent, principled, and perhaps a little rigid. No one mentioned the fear she inspired, nor the pressure she exerted. Miss Marple knew that memory was already at work. In the days that followed, fragments of truth surfaced gently. Mr. Kemp resigned his position as treasurer, citing health. Miss Crowe requested a transfer to a neighbouring school, explaining that she felt it was time for change. Others withdrew quietly from roles they had once guarded fiercely, as though leadership itself had become suspect. One afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Leonard outside the grocer's. "I don't know how we didn't see it," Mrs. Leonard said, shaking her head. "She was always so capable." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Capability can be very convincing." Mrs. Leonard frowned. "I keep thinking about the things we allowed, the things we didn't question." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That is a useful thought, provided it is not discarded too quickly." Inspector Hargreaves visited Miss Marple on his final evening in Barton Lee. He accepted a cup of tea and sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "She confessed," he said. "Not dramatically. She said she acted to prevent chaos." "And did she regret it?" Miss Marple asked. He considered. She regretted being forced to act. Miss Marple nodded. "That is not quite the same thing. She believed the village needed protecting," the inspector continued. "From scandal, from disorder, from itself." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "many people do." He sighed. "I've seen this before. Small communities build private systems to avoid embarrassment. They rarely consider what happens when those systems gain teeth. Or when someone decides to use them," Miss Marple added. When Inspector Hargreaves left the next morning, Barton Lee felt oddly leaderless. No one rushed to fill the space Mrs. Price had occupied. Decisions were deferred, meetings postponed. For a while nothing moved at all. Miss Marple noticed that this unsettled people more than any arrest. Gradually, however, life resumed in tentative ways. Someone organized a rota for the church flowers. Another suggested a shared effort to repair the footpath near the stream. Decisions were discussed openly, sometimes clumsily, but with a caution that had not existed before. Miss Marple approved. One evening she walked past the village hall. The windows were dark, the doors closed, the building stripped of its former authority. It looked smaller somehow, less important. At home she poured herself tea and allowed it to cool. She thought of Mrs. Holt, so certain that exposure equaled justice. She thought of Mrs. Price, equally certain that concealment equaled protection. Both had believed they were acting for the good of the village. Both had been wrong. Barton Lee would tell this story many times in the years to come. It would be simplified, softened, reshaped to fit comfortable conclusions. Mrs. Price would become a cautionary tale. Mrs. Holt is a tragic figure. the files a misguided experiment. What would be forgotten, Miss Marple knew, was the willingness with which everyone had allowed judgment to be centralized. The relief of letting someone else decide what should be known and what should remain hidden. As night settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting steadily. The needles clicked softly, a sound both repetitive and reassuring. Each stitch depended on attention. Miss one, and the pattern faltered. Understanding, she reflected, worked in much the same way. The village had been shaken, but it was learning. Slowly, imperfectly, it was relearning the value of question over certainty, of listening over control. For now, that would have to be enough. The scandal file was closed, but the habit of attention, once awakened, lingered, and Miss Marple, content in her quiet place, continued to watch. In the weeks that followed, Barton Lee moved through a cautious season of adjustment, as though the village were testing the ground beneath its feet before committing to any direction. Autumn settled in gently, leaves gathering along the lanes, hedges softening at the edges, and daylight thinning earlier each afternoon. Outwardly, life appeared unchanged. Inwardly, there was a carefulness that had not existed before. Miss Marple noticed it most in conversation. People spoke more slowly now, pausing before offering opinions that once would have flowed freely. Suggestions were framed as questions. Advice was prefaced with apology. It was not humility exactly, but awareness, and Miss Marple knew that awareness was often the first casualty of comfort. The village hall remained closed while its future was discussed at length. No one seemed eager to reopen it too quickly. When it was finally agreed that it would serve again as a shared space, the decision was made collectively, after more meetings than anyone could remember having attended before. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple. Mrs. Holt's house was cleared quietly. Her belongings were distributed to distant relatives, and the garden, once trimmed with exacting precision, was allowed to grow a little wild. Neighbors remarked on it with faint unease, as though nature itself were now expressing an opinion. Miss Marple walked past the house one afternoon and paused briefly. She reflected that Mrs. Holt had been sincere, even admirable in her own rigid way. She had believed rules were protection, that record-keeping equaled justice. She had never considered that power without restraint would eventually turn inward. That blind spot, Miss Marple knew, was not uncommon. Mrs. Price's absence left a different mark. Where once decisions had been swift and unquestioned, there was now delay. People disagreed openly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes irritably. More than one villager complained that things were much less efficient than before. "Yes," Miss Marple replied when she heard this. "Efficiency often depends on silence." One afternoon Miss Crow visited Miss Marple for tea. She looked tired but relieved. "I've been thinking about leaving," she admitted. "Not because of what happened, but because of what I allowed." "And what was that?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I allowed myself to believe that restraint excused participation," Miss Crow said. "I stayed because I thought I could temper it. But tempering something dangerous still allows it to exist." Miss Marple nodded. "That is a difficult realization, but a valuable one." Miss Crow smiled faintly. "I wish Agnes had understood it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "so do I." As Barton Lee continued to recover, small changes accumulated. A notice appeared in the shop window inviting residents to raise concerns openly rather than through anonymous letters. A suggestion box was placed near the post office, not locked, and emptied publicly once a week. These gestures were modest, even symbolic, but symbols, Miss Marple reflected, mattered greatly in small communities. She noticed, too, that people began checking facts more carefully before repeating stories. Gossip did not vanish. Villages would not survive without it, but it changed tone. There was less relish, more caution. Names were mentioned less often. Conclusions were deferred. The scandal file, once so powerful, had become a kind of ghost. People referred to it obliquely, as though saying its name too often might restore it. Miss Marple thought that sensible. Some things deserved to be remembered only for what they taught, not for what they contained. One evening, as dusk settled early and lights came on across the village, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting. The steady rhythm calmed her thoughts. She considered how easily Barton Lee had surrendered judgment to a few well-organized individuals, how comfortable it had been to let someone else decide what was appropriate, what was safe, what was best left unspoken. Comfort, she knew, was persuasive. Mrs. Price had not seen herself as cruel. Mrs. Holt had not seen herself as dangerous. Both had believed they were serving the greater good. Between them, a system had grown that rewarded fear and punished honesty. It was that system, Miss Marple believed, that had truly committed the crime. Outside, footsteps passed along the lane, unhurried now. Voices drifted briefly, then faded. Life was resuming its ordinary patterns, as it always did, but those patterns bore the faint impression of interruption. Miss Marple poured herself tea and let it cool, watching the steam rise and disappear. She reflected that patience revealed what haste concealed, and that waiting often allowed truth to surface without force. The village would not remain cautious forever. Time had a way of dulling memory, and comfort would eventually return. Authority would once again appear attractive when it arrived wearing competence and reassurance. But perhaps, she thought, there would be a pause next time, a moment when someone asked who held the files, who decided what was known, who benefited from silence. That pause mattered. As autumn deepened and Barton Lee prepared for winter, Miss Marple felt a quiet, measured satisfaction. Not because justice had been done, that was merely necessary, but because attention had been restored, if only temporarily. Some mysteries ended with arrests, the better ones ended with reflection. Miss Marple set aside her teacup and returned to her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the growing quiet. Outside, the village breathed evenly, unaware that its greatest safeguard lay not in rules or records, but in the simple, difficult habit of paying attention. For now, at least, Barton Lee remembered that. And for Miss Marple, that was enough. As winter drew closer, Barton Lee settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that invited introspection whether one welcomed it or not. Frost edged the lanes in the mornings, and smoke rose steadily from chimneys as villagers retreated indoors earlier each evening. Outwardly, life had regained its familiar shape, yet beneath that surface lay a collective awareness that something essential had been disturbed and could not be entirely restored. Miss Marple sensed it most keenly in the pauses. People paused before speaking, before offering opinions, before assuming agreement. These hesitations were brief, often unconscious, but they marked a shift away from the certainty that had once defined village life. Authority no longer arrived unquestioned. Efficiency was viewed with a measure of suspicion. Silence, once comforting, now carried an echo. The village hall reopened at last, though it felt different without the weight of unquestioned leadership pressing down upon it. Chairs were set out for meetings that lasted longer than they used to, and decisions were debated with an earnestness that sometimes bordered on discomfort. Disagreement, once avoided, became an accepted inconvenience. Miss Marple attended one such meeting, sitting quietly at the back. She listened as voices overlapped, as proposals were revised and reconsidered, as people learned again how to share responsibility. It was not graceful, but it was honest. Afterward, Mrs. Leonard approached her, her expression thoughtful. "I never realized how easy it was," she said, "to let someone else decide everything." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "it spares one the effort of thinking." Mrs. Leonard sighed. "I don't think I want things to be easy in that way again." Miss Marple smiled gently. In private homes, similar reckonings took place. Old grievances surfaced quietly, discussed, and sometimes resolved. Some relationships grew strained, others unexpectedly stronger. A few villagers chose to leave Barton Lee altogether, seeking distance from memories they preferred not to examine too closely. Miss Marple understood that as well. One afternoon she received a short note from Inspector Hargreaves. The legal proceedings were moving forward steadily. Mrs. Price remained composed, still framing her actions as necessary, still convinced that she had acted to preserve order. The files, he wrote, were being reviewed carefully, with most slated for destruction. They should never have existed, he added. Miss Marple folded the note and placed it carefully in her drawer. Records created without accountability rarely deserved preservation. As the days shortened, Barton Lee prepared for the holidays. Decorations appeared in windows, modest and restrained. Plans were made collectively, sometimes laboriously, but with a new awareness of inclusion. No one person took charge of everything. Tasks were shared, and mistakes were tolerated. Miss Marple approved of that most of all. One evening, as she walked home beneath a pale winter sky, she passed the village hall and paused. Light spilled from its windows, and inside she could hear laughter, uneven singing, the scrape of chairs being rearranged. It was imperfect, disorganized, and entirely human. She continued on her way, reflecting that perfection was rarely safe. At home, Miss Marple poured herself tea and allowed it to cool, watching the steam fade slowly into the air. The ritual gave her space to consider the path that had led Barton Lee here. A village had built a system to avoid scandal, believing that secrecy equaled safety. That system had grown powerful, insulated, and unquestioned, and when it had been threatened, someone had killed to protect it. Mrs. Holt had believed in exposure without mercy. Mrs. Price had believed in concealment without restraint. Between those extremes lay the simple truth that neither listening nor consent had ever been part of the equation. That, Miss Marple knew, was why the tragedy had occurred. Outside, the village settled into the night. Lights blinked out one by one, and the lanes grew still. Barton Lee slept with the fragile confidence of a place that believed it had learned something important, though it could not yet articulate exactly what that was. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting steadily, her thoughts calm. She did not expect lasting transformation. Villages, like people, reverted to habit once discomfort faded. But habits could be altered, even slightly, and slight alterations sometimes changed everything. She believed Barton Lee would remember this, at least in small ways. In a pause before judgment, in a question asked instead of an assumption made, in the quiet refusal to let one voice speak for all the others. Those moments mattered. As she set her knitting aside and finished her tea, Miss Marple felt no sense of triumph, only a familiar acceptance. The mystery had not been difficult to solve in the end. Human nature rarely was. It repeated itself faithfully, requiring only patience and attention to recognize. What remained was not resolution, but understanding. Understanding, Miss Marple reflected as the village slept beneath its winter calm, was the only safeguard that ever truly endured. By the time winter settled fully over Barton Lee, the village had grown quieter in ways that went beyond the season. Snow softened the lanes, muted footsteps, and turned familiar paths into pale, careful routes that required attention with every step. Miss Marple found the change appropriate. Winter had a way of insisting on thoughtfulness, and Barton Lee, whether he liked it or not, had been given much to think about. The village hall reopened at last, not with ceremony but with restraint. Notices were pinned carefully, written in neutral language, and signed by more than one name. Meetings were held less frequently, and when they did occur, they ended without the decisive neatness people once admired. Discussions wandered, decisions were postponed, people left with questions rather than conclusions. It was, Miss Marple observed, an improvement. She attended a small gathering one evening, sitting unobtrusively near the back. Someone suggested an idea and then paused, waiting. Another disagreed gently, offering an alternative. No one rushed to close the matter. The room felt uncertain but honest. Miss Marple thought of how different it was from the confidence that had once filled the same space, and how much safer it felt now. In private homes the effects were more subtle. Old habits reasserted themselves slowly, but not without friction. People checked themselves mid-sentence. Some caught the impulse to report, to record, to remember too precisely, and allowed it to pass. Others struggled, missing the clarity that came from having rules enforced by someone else. Comfort, Miss Marple knew, was a persuasive temptation. Mrs. Price's name is spoken less often now. When it was, it carried neither venom nor sympathy, but a quiet unease. Mrs. Holt's memory, too, had begun to shift, reshaped into something more palatable. She was remembered for her dedication rather than her rigidity, her service rather than her severity. Miss Marple understood this instinct. Villages preferred their past softened, even when it lost its sharpest lessons in the process. One afternoon, Miss Marple received a final letter from Inspector Hargreaves. The case was concluded. The remaining files had been destroyed, their contents deemed unreliable and harmful. Official recommendations had been issued about transparency, oversight, and the dangers of informal authority. He thanked her again, though she had done nothing more, she thought, than pay attention. She placed the letter aside and made herself tea, letting it cool as she watched the snow fall outside her window. She reflected that the true danger in Barton Lee had never been secrecy alone, nor even judgment, but the relief of delegation. The village had been grateful to let others decide what was right, what was necessary, what could be hidden. That gratitude had created space for power to grow unnoticed. As the days shortened further, preparations for the holidays were made with cautious cooperation. Decorations appeared modestly. Plans were discussed openly. Responsibilities were shared, sometimes awkwardly, but without the old certainty that someone else would manage it all. Mistakes were made. They endured. Miss Marple found this heartening. On Christmas Eve she walked through the village as dusk fell, the snow reflecting light from windows where families gathered quietly. Laughter drifted into the cold air, uneven and genuine. She paused near the hall and listened. Inside, voices sang without perfect harmony, rising and falling without direction. It was messy and human and entirely without supervision. At home, she lit her lamp and settled into her chair, knitting resting lightly in her hands. She thought again of Mrs. Holt, convinced that exposure was justice, and of Mrs. Price, equally convinced that concealment was protection. Both had acted from certainty. Neither had paused to listen. That pause, Miss Marple believed, was everything. The mystery, she reflected, had never truly been about the files or even the murder. It had been about what happened when attention was surrendered, when judgment was centralized, and when people mistook order for goodness. The crime had been the inevitable outcome of a system built without humility. As winter deepened, Barton Lee slept beneath its familiar calm, believing itself restored. Miss Marple knew better. Restoration was never complete, nor should it be. What mattered was not that the village felt safe again, but that it had learned, however briefly, to question the feeling. She finished her tea and set the cup aside, the steam long gone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing sharp edges, inviting new paths. In spring, the village would look unchanged. The lanes would curve as they always had. The hall would host gatherings once more. Life would continue. But Miss Marple hoped that somewhere beneath the comfort, a habit had been altered, that someone would hesitate before judging, that someone would ask before recording, that someone would listen. She smiled faintly and returned to her knitting, the needles moving with steady care. Each stitch required attention. Miss one, and the pattern faltered. Understanding, she thought, worked the same way. The village scandal file was closed now, its power gone. What remained was quieter and far more difficult, the responsibility of noticing. For Barton Lee, and for Miss Marple, that would have to be enough.